I'm making a new fruiting tub, and in order to see if it works, I need something to fruit in it. So in this video I'm going to make up some substrate, and I'm going to spawn it with a fruiting bag that I'd gotten at the local farmer's market because I was too lazy to do all of this the right way. I'm using a mixture of beet pulp, Coco Coir, and hardwood sawdust via smoker pellets, and a few additives. This is the first time I've ever used beet pulp. I did a lot of reading, and after hours of reading I still don't know exactly what the best way of using beet pulp is, if it is a supplement, if it's a substrate, if it's somewhere in between, if it's going to make everything turn green. What I did immediately notice is that it is very dry, crunchy, and loves sucking up water. It sucked up huge amounts of water. I had a formula that I typically used in the hardwood mix, and the water part of that just went out the window. The moisture content of the resulting product is huge. It has kind of a rubbery feel to it, and it just sucks up water, which can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. I guess we're going to find out in a month or so if and when all of this colonizes. So the mixture is equal parts by weight sawdust, Coco Coir, and beet pulp. I also added some gypsum and some crushed pulverized oyster shell. The way I made the oyster shell was taking a bag of oyster shell chips for chickens, putting it into a blender, and letting it run for 20 minutes off and on. And don't do this with a good blender. Go to Goodwill, find a blender there. It will over time kind of trash your blender. I'm adding the hardwood smoker pellets. My recommendation is try and get oak and hickory. Avoid apple because it probably has toxic chemicals and pesticides, God knows what, in it. You'll see that I am using apple. It's just for a demonstration, and I'm going to be the only one eating these. So if it kills me, no great loss there. I'm adding the Coco Coir dry. It's lightweight. Pretty much all mushrooms seem to eat it, more or less. Wood lovers will eat it. Compost, manure mushrooms will eat it. A lot of stuff eats it. It's not very nutrient dense. It's pretty lightweight, so the yields aren't going to be great, but it does hold a lot of water, and it's easy to work with. Now I'm adding the beet pulp. I think it was like $18 for a big bag of this stuff. It's hard and crunchy out of the bag. Once you add water, it becomes soft and rubbery, kind of like gummy bears or something like that. It holds an enormous amount of water. I don't know what the nutrient value is, if this stuff is going to make everything contaminate. The amount of moisture that it does hold is kind of interesting, and I'm hoping that this will come in useful later. One of the limiting factors when growing mushrooms is how much moisture you can get into the substrate. The mushrooms need it, but you don't want them swimming in it, so perhaps the beet pulp will act kind of like vermiculite does in storing water, but be a lot cheaper and easier to source. And lastly, we add some gypsum and some pulverized oyster shell. Exactly how much of this to add is up to you. Recommendations seem to be anywhere from 2 to 10% by weight, depending on what you're growing, what you're trying to do. If you put it in and it goes south, don't blame me. Now I'm adding some more water. In this case, I'm adding very hot water. I've previously added water in here and stirred it, mixed it, added a lot more water than I thought that this would need, partly because of the cocoa coir and the beet pulp being very absorbent. How much water you should add, well, that's up to you. You kind of have to develop a feel for this and what your particular substrate should feel like when it's at field capacity. As a general rule of thumb, when you squeeze it, there should not be a lot of water coming out. There should be a drop or two or maybe three, enough to really show you that there's moisture in there, but not so much that you're drowning the mycelium. The first mistake people make is they think mushrooms need a lot more water than they do. If you're just starting out, odds are you're more likely to kill the mushrooms with water than dryness. Adding the water hot helps to absorb it into the substrate, and it helps to rehydrate the wood pellets. There are those out there who basically just dump a bunch of hot water in with all the ingredients, put it in some sort of insulated container like a cooler, let it sit and cook under its own temperature and pasteurize. Depending on what you're using, that can work pretty well. It usually works with wood pellets quite well. Coco, meh. Beet pulp, I got no idea. In this case, I would add a liter of water, let it sit, mix it, wait for 30 minutes, an hour, add another liter of water, and then another and another and another. It just kept adding it in, being amazed at how much water it sucked up. I'm going to go ahead and pasteurize this in the oven just to be sure, because I don't want to mess it up and get set back weeks. As a general rule of thumb, if it's important, you try and do it the right way. Everything's been mixed, it's been allowed to sit for a number of hours. I've added hot water, mixed, let it sit, add more hot water, let it sit. I purchased 2 roasting pans at Goodwill for $3.50. Real good price on that. They're reusable, they transmit heat well, and I can fit both of them in the oven at the same time. So I'm filling these up, packing them down, getting it packed as tightly as possible to help conduct the heat, and then these are going to go in the oven at the lowest possible setting, which is about 170. Might be a little hot. Everyone says it works. It's always worked in the past. They're going to sit in there for about 4 hours, and then I'm going to pull them out, let them cool, and after it's cooled I'll be able to spawn into them, and hopefully everything will grow and turn white, and it won't turn black or green or any of the bad colors. Having reusable pans is very useful. If you don't, you can use various bags and stuff like that. Oven bags work well. I recently tried some filter patch bags in the oven. That did not work well. The plastic melted, stuck together, sealed everything, made quite the mess, and destroyed the bags. So we won't be doing that again. Oven bags I've had good luck with. If you use them, you'll probably want to stick them in a tray and keep them from falling down all over the place if it ruptures. As I fill the roasting pans, I'm packing them down, trying to get in as much as possible and compressing it to help transmit the heat. The moisture content is probably a little wet, but I'm assuming that some of it will cook off during the pasteurization process. Moisture content is one of those things that is more science than art in a lot of cases, and you kind of have to just get the feel for it, which after failing a few times you eventually will. Okay, now everything has been pasteurized for 4 hours. The roasting pans were then taken out and allowed to cool. You want to make sure that everything cools completely, because if you put spawn into hot substrate, you will kill it. Now I'm cutting open the bag, the fruiting bag that I got at the farmer's market, and shoveling some of the substrate into the trays, which I got from Walmart. They were chosen because of the depth and size. 3 of them fit just about perfectly in the fruiting tub. I put a plastic bag, a little kitchen bag, into the tub as a liner because I want to be able to seal the tub up and keep it safe from some contamination and increase the carbon dioxide levels in there. You don't want exposure to the air. I shovel in a layer of the substrate, and then I will break up chunks of the oyster mycelium and drop those in, creating a layer. I'm using a very high spawn ratio here, probably like 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, because I want to make sure that this works. I'm not sure how well the beet pulp will work, if it will cause contamination or not, having never used it. So I'm using a lot of spawn. How much spawn you use depends on what you're doing, what your goals are, how well you know what you're doing, what your substrate is, what species it is. So that rule of 10% or 5% or 1 to 1 or 4 to 1 or whatever it is you read on the internet has to be taken in light of the fact that it really depends on what you're trying to do with the spawn. So I'm making this big layer cake, and then it will gently get packed down. I think I'm doing about 3 layers here. You want to make sure that your chunks of spawn are fairly large. If you break it down too far, it doesn't seem to work real well. And I like having the spawn together in a layer so it's close, it can knit into a group. Oysters are very aggressive species, and if you get some together, they tend to do very well at fighting off and preventing any contamination. Once this is done, I'll go ahead and cover it up with the bag, move on to the next one, and then after all of them are done, I'll go ahead and put in some air vents so they can breathe. You do need a little bit of air to get in, you don't need a whole lot, and however it's getting in there should ideally have some method of filtering it and keeping some of the contamination out, whether that's polyfill, filter patch bag, or something like that. I'm making up some filters for the bags. This is just a drip irrigation fitting that has a small lip on one end. I shove polyfill into it and then zip tie the bag around it. There are a lot of other ways of doing this. You can use polyfill. The blue synthetic swamp cooler pad works well. You can use filter patches. Anything that kind of sort of filters the air out seems to work. You don't want to make it too big, don't want to make it too small. You will need to get some fresh air in there. With the bags, I can kind of use them as a bellows, and I can suck air in, blow air out periodically, and exchange it if necessary. After making up the filters, I'll use a zip tie and zip tie the bag around them, and then trim off all the excess of the bag, exposing it, and it's done. After a week, the leftover fruiting block, which I had about half left that I was planning on spawning, was completely colonized and fluffy and white, so I decided instead to toss that into the fruiting chamber. It's getting a few little bumps on there, like maybe it's going to do something. A couple of the spawned tubs had definite growth on the surface that I could see through the vent port, so they might be actually colonizing instead of infecting. The smell of blue oysters is a little different. I don't think I've smelled them before. Not nearly as nice as Phoenix oysters and some of the other oyster species, but it's not horrible, so I don't think that this stuff is contaminating. We'll give it a few more weeks and see if maybe we've got something ready to fruit. So if everything goes properly, this convoluted process leads to me having a few test blocks I can put in the chamber to fruit and see whether or not it kills it, and then start adjusting accordingly. This is not the easiest way of doing things, and I'm hoping that this process can be streamlined into something that's only going to take 20 minutes once a week in order to keep the fruiting tub filled and produce a steady stream of mushrooms to eat.